Welcome back to the deep dive. Every time we do this, I think we've seen it all, but then our amazing listeners bring us something completely new.
Truly. It never ceases to amaze me.
And today's deep dive is no exception. You've sent us some data focused on, well, Antarctica. But that's not all, right? There's a YouTube video in the mix as well.
Yes, a transcript from the Spacebusters channel titled, get this, Scamtarctica, the Antarctic Circle Jerk.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we're diving into some pointed commentary, it seems.
Absolutely. The video basically uses this data on Antarctic sunlight patterns, or at least what's publicly available, to challenge the whole idea of the Earth being a globe.
A direct hit at one of those core concepts we often take for granted.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin with this? I guess our mission here is to, as always, really dissect these claims, see what this data actually tells us, and, maybe uncover some aha moments for our listeners along the way.
Sounds like a plan.
And since we're talking Antarctica, let's be specific. We're going to be looking at this whole idea of 24-hour sunlight periods, day lengths, and when exactly sunrise, sunset, and solar noon happen down there, at least according to the video.
All right, so the heart of this video's argument, and it references someone named Jiren, is that if the Earth is a globe, like we're taught, locations at the same latitude should have the same amount of daylight, same periods of, that 24-hour sun.
Makes sense on the surface, right?
Yeah.
If you're at the same distance from the equator, you should experience similar things.
Right, exactly. But the video then goes on to show all these cases where data from different websites for Antarctic bases that are at basically the same latitude, well, they don't match up.
And that's where things start getting interesting, right?
Per-
So they kick things off with McMurdo Station, which the transcript says is around 77.5 degrees south latitude. And they look at three websites, timeaided.com, dateandtime.info, and sunrise.maplogs.com. Specifically, they look at when the 24-hour sun period supposedly starts and ends, and I guess what they found was not what they expected.
Let's just say there's some disagreement. Dateandtime.info says the 24-hour sun at McMurdo starts on October 22nd. Sunrise.maplogs.com, though, puts it on the 23rd. Then you've got timeanddate.com, which has it all the way on the 24th.
So right off the bat, we've got a 2-day spread.
Right, which is odd because you'd think this would be, pretty cut and dry.
Yeah, it's not like predicting the weather. This is supposed to be based on pretty solid astronomical calculations.
Exactly. And it gets, more interesting when you look at when the 24-hour sun supposedly ends.
Yeah, what happens there?
So dateandtime.info and timeanddate.com actually agree on February 20th. But then sunrise.maplogs.com throws a wrench in things, saying it ends on February 19th.
So even when there's some agreement, there's still this little bit of variation that kind of makes you wonder.
And keep in mind, the video emphasizes that all these websites, they're all supposedly working off the same model of the Earth, the globe.
Right. It's not like they're using different theories about how the Earth is shaped or anything.
Exactly.
Okay, so then the transcript mentions they dig even deeper into McMurdo, looking at October 21st and February 20th. What's special about those dates?
Well, on those dates, they compared the sunrise and sunset times from the same three websites, and again, found some discrepancies.
How big are we talking?
Some were just a few minutes off, but others were over 20 minutes different. And because of that, the calculated day lengths on those days, well, they varied by almost 20 minutes too.
Wow, so we're not talking about tiny little discrepancies here.
No, not at all. And to illustrate this, the video makes this analogy. Imagine if you had three people standing in Paris, all looking at the sunset, and they all report times that are 20 minutes apart.
Yeah, that would definitely raise some eyebrows. Like, are they even looking at the same sun?
Exactly. The point being, if these models and data are accurate, you shouldn't see that kind of variation for something as basic as sunset time in the same location.
Okay, so McMurdo has some, let's call them inconsistencies. But then they move on to Casey Station, which the transcript describes as being way further away, like 1,615 miles from McMurdo. What happens there?
Well, the discrepancies become even more, I guess you could say, pronounced. We're talking about a 3-day difference in the reported start date of the 24-hour sun period across those three websites. One of them puts it much earlier than the other two.
So it's not just a matter of a day here or there anymore.
No, and the end date is also off by 2 to 3 days, depending on which source you look at.
So the total length of time that Casey Station is supposed to have this continuous sunlight, that's also up for debate.
Absolutely. There's a 5 to 6 day difference depending on who you believe.
And again, this is all supposedly based on the same globe model calculations.
Right, which is where the video's argument starts to gain some traction, at least according to them. If the model is solid, these numbers should be consistent.
Okay, but they don't stop there, do they?
Right.
The transcript says they go even broader, looking at more Antarctic bases.
Yeah, they claim that out of 18 bases that should, according to latitude, have this 24-hour sun, there were differences of 1 to 5 days in how long that period supposedly lasts, at least when comparing timeanddate.com and dateandtime.info.
So it's not just an isolated issue with one or two stations.
Right. And what's even more, well, striking is that only 2 out of those 18 bases had even one date, either the start or the end, matching up between those two websites. No base had both start and end dates aligning perfectly.
So there's a lot of variation in the data, to say the least.
Exactly. And to kind of drive that point home, they even bring in a couple more websites, timegenie.com and sunrise-sunset.com, which apparently show even more discrepancies.
Just adding fuel to the fire. Okay, but then there's this whole thing about solar noon that the transcript describes as the smoky gun. What's that about?
So here's where it gets even more, well, questionable. They notice that while timeanddate.com and dateandtime.info often agree on the solar noon time for various Antarctic bases on the same day, particularly on days just before or after that 24-hour sun period.
Okay, I'm following so far.
They often disagree on the sunrise and sunset times for those same bases on those same days, which means they also disagree on the length of the day.
So wait, the sun is reaching its highest point at the same time, but it's rising and setting at different times? How does that even work?
That's exactly the point the video is making. It shouldn't work that way, logically. If you agree on when the sun is highest in the sky, you should also agree on when it pops up and when it goes down. They're all connected.
Okay, so that does sound kind of like a red flag, or a smoky gun, as they call it.
Right, and they provide a whole list of stations where this supposedly happens, including Casey, Dumont d'Urville, Mawson, Rivera, San Martin, you name it, all these bases with the same solar noon time, but different sunrise, sunset, and day lengths.
So they're saying that not only is the data inconsistent, but it's inconsistent in a way that just doesn't make sense, astronomically speaking.
Exactly.
All right, so then the transcript shifts gears a bit and starts talking about specific stations based on their latitude. They bring up S4, Troll, and Halley stations. What's the story there?
Well, this part focuses on how daylight hours should change based on how far south you are, your latitude. These 3 stations are relatively close to each other in terms of latitude, but the video claims that dateandtime.info says that Troll Station, which is slightly further south than S4, actually has a longer 24-hour sun period than S4.
So if you're moving closer to the South Pole during the summer, you should get more daylight, not less, right?
That's the logic, yes. But according to this data, that's not always the case.
And it's not just about how long the 24-hour sun lasts, is it?
No, the transcript points out some really big discrepancies in the specific sunrise and sunset times, day lengths, and even solar noon times between Troll and S4 on October 29th.
Like, how big are we talking here?
I mean, the sunrise times are over 5 hours apart, the sunset times are over 6 hours apart, and even the solar noon times are over 6 hours apart, which, I mean, that just seems wild considering they're relatively close in latitude.
Yeah, I mean, if you were standing at one of these stations, you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, it's pretty much the same as that other station a few hundred miles away.
Definitely not. The differences would be obvious.
So, okay, 2 stations, some issues. But then they bring up Maitrey and Harati stations, which are also pretty close in terms of latitude. What happens there?
More inconsistencies. There's apparently a 3-day difference in both the start and end dates of their 24-hour sun periods, which means there's a difference of 6 to 7 days in the total length of that period, even though Parati is only a little bit further south than Maitrey.
Okay, so more the same, basically.
Oh.
Latitude doesn't seem to be the deciding factor here.
Right. And on October 29th, there were also significant differences in sunrise, sunset, and day length between Maitrey and S4, even though their solar noon times were pretty close. Like, Maitrey's sunrise was 43 minutes earlier, its sunset over an hour earlier, and its day length about 30 minutes shorter.
So again, the timing of solar noon doesn't seem to be a reliable predictor of when the sun actually rises and sets.
Precisely.
Okay, but then the transcript says there's this key discrepancy with Rothera and San Martin stations on the Antarctic Peninsula. What makes this one so important?
Well, these 2 stations are supposedly at almost the same latitude, and they're physically very close to each other on the peninsula. But the video points out that there's a 3-day difference in the reported start dates and a 3 to 4-day difference in the end dates of their 24-hour sun periods.
So we're back to those big discrepancies again.
Yeah, and it ends up being a difference of about 9 days in the total length of that 24-hour sun period between these two stations that are practically neighbors.
9 days. That's a huge difference.
It really is, and it gets even weirder. Even on days when both stations are supposed to have a normal sunrise and sunset, their day lengths are still different by 20 to 53 minutes, even though the sources often agree on the time of solar noon for both locations.
So it's like even when they're not in that 24-hour sun period, the data still doesn't quite add up.
Right, it doesn't seem to follow the pattern you would expect on a globe.
And then they go on to compare Rothera and San Martin to other bases at similar latitudes, right?
Yeah, the video says that if you look at all these bases that should have similar 24-hour sun periods based on their latitude, well, they don't. The timing and duration of those periods don't line up the way you would expect if latitude were the main factor.
So at this point, the video is basically saying, hey, look at all this inconsistent data. Something's not right.
Exactly. They argue that if these websites, which are all supposed to be using the same model, the globe, can't even agree on something as basic as daylight hours in Antarctica, then maybe there's something wrong with the model itself.
Okay, but they don't just leave it at that, do they? They also throw in some alternative explanations, right?
Right. They briefly mention some things like potential holographic fakery, or even some kind of, well, more out there ideas about a different shape of the Earth and how light works.
And I guess, it's worth noting that they're not really presenting these as, like, proven facts. They're more like possibilities they think need to be considered.
Exactly. They're not saying they have all the answers, but they're saying there are more questions here than people might realize.
Okay, so back to Antarctica. The transcript mentions that they point out something interesting about the bases that supposedly don't have 24-hour sunlight.
Yeah, the video emphasizes that all these bases that allegedly don't experience a 24-hour sun period, well, they're all clustered on the Antarctic Peninsula.
Interesting. And I guess the implication is that, maybe that pattern makes more sense on a different model of the Earth, like a flat Earth.
That seems to be their point, yes.
Okay, and then there's this whole bit about Union Glacier. What's that about?
Well, apparently Union Glacier is a tourist destination in Antarctica, but they couldn't find any data for it on those websites they were looking at.
So it's like a missing piece of the puzzle.
In a way, yes. And the video kind of speculates that maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe Union Glacier is in a special location where this 24-hour sun phenomenon happens naturally. Or maybe, they're hinting at something more artificial even though they don't explicitly say it.
And they also mention a Chilean military base nearby with some funky GPS coordinates, right?
Right. Lieutenant Arturo Perotti. Just another little detail that adds to the overall mystery, I guess.
Okay, so we're almost at the end of this deep dive, but there's one more thing, right? The sunrise time anomaly with Rothera and Vernadsky stations.
Oh, yeah. That one's a real head-scratcher. So you've got Rothera, which supposedly has 24-hour sun at certain times, and then nearby you have Vernadsky, which is further north and supposedly doesn't have 24-hour sun.
Got it. So you would think Vernadsky would get the sun first, since it's further away from the South Pole.
But here's the thing. According to the data, Vernadsky's solar noon actually happens 16 minutes before Rothera's, which makes sense because it's further east. But its sunrise is over an hour later than Rothera's, like an hour and 17 minutes later.
So it's like the sun is skipping over Vernadsky and hitting Rothera first, even though Vernadsky is closer to where the sun should be rising from.
That's essentially the argument, yes. It doesn't seem to follow the logic of how the sun should move across the sky if the Earth is a globe.
Okay, so after all that, what's the video's final takeaway? What do they conclude from all these inconsistencies?
They basically say that all this conflicting data shows that the globe model can't accurately predict what's actually happening with daylight in Antarctica. So they conclude that the globe model itself is probably wrong.
Wow, okay, so this deep dive has definitely taken us down a rabbit hole of data and questioning some pretty fundamental concepts.
It has. It's really made us think about how we understand these things.
And, it's important to emphasize that we've just been presenting the information from the video and the data sources they provided. We're not saying we agree or disagree with their conclusions.
Right, we're just laying it all out there for our listeners to consider.
And I think there's a lot to consider here. The sheer number of inconsistencies they point out, especially with the timing and duration of 24-hour sunlight at these stations that are so close together, it definitely raises some eyebrows.
It does. And those alternative explanations they mentioned While they might sound a little out there to some people, they do kind of make you think, well, what if?
Exactly. And you know what? If you're as intrigued by all this as we are, we encourage you to go check out those websites yourself. Look at the data, see what you think.
It's all publicly available, so you can do your own investigation.
And maybe, while you're at it, think about this. If we're seeing this much variation in data for one region of the Earth, what does that say about the accuracy of these global models in general? And what does it say about the information we rely on to understand our world?
Food for thought.
Absolutely.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for joining us.